Yeah, so thanks again for letting me do this again again. Apparently, yeah, I was, hoping it would go well enough this morning that you'd let me back to do the second one, which is good. So um I don't know if anybody was here for the first one. There's a few little tweaks that I made based on some interesting points that we talked about afterwards. In that after the, in the sort of the discussion after that presentation earlier, and I had to like tweak a few things to take them out so it wasn't so massively overlong. But anyway, yes, thanks for letting me ramble on a bit more about Bond and the Gothic and the many connections that I personally feel there are between um ideas of the Gothic mode and Bond in its many different media incarnations and Bond is one of those series that's went on so long and has been so much of a pop culture force that basically almost any medium you can think of, there's almost certainly something to do with Bond related to it. And as I say, I think Bond and the Gothic is such an incredibly rich area, and I can't possibly, in the time I've got, cover everything or even all media. For example, I would have loved to have talked a bit about the video game incarnations of Bond and how they utilize aspects of the Gothic. But again, it's such a different medium that it's just something I couldn't even fit in a tangent. I have to go on this whole like framework of how that works. So I know there's things that I've missed out and that I've had to omit for reasons of time being a bit selective. I know when we were sort of talking about this yesterday, there was like 4 or 5 different films or scenes within films that I was like, oh yes, that would be a great example. Um, so yeah, hopefully in the discussion we'll be able to go over some of those at the end if people I can think of any more that I've omitted. But like I say, I think it's a very interesting area and one I also feel is quite under researched as far as um, Gothic studies, Bond studies goes. I think it's certainly worth more academic work being done on it. There are a few existing articles, like there was an interesting chapter from 2011 by Lena Stevka investigating the intertextual influences that Bond's had on other contemporary Gothic visual culture. And the example they used was Alan Moore's 1999 graphic novel, The League of Extraordinary Gentlemen. And then earlier last year, Dr. Monica Germana published a chapter in a book called Sometimes the Old Ways Are the Best, a Gothic reading of technology and the body in Sam Mendes' Skyfall, looking exclusively at that particular Daniel Craig film and how that works with the Gothic. And as Dr. Germana describes, Gothic narratives are, to quote her, both haunted by the past and unsettled by change, ushered in by the future. And I think this is one of the most common threads and sources of threat within the James Bond series, particularly in its cinematic incarnation. And a great number of Bond films have feature anxieties over what is perceived as oncoming changes in the future, particularly those involving some sort of new technology. And I sort of mentioned cloning in the opening before I started as an example of a common aspect that fans think the series could go in to look at, and it's quite indicative of the series and how it works with technology. That's a sort of plot line that people suspect we could go there in the future. And for example, 1974's Man with the Golden Gun, which was produced during the height of the energy crisis in the early 1970s, considered how new forms of energy like solar power could be abused or sabotaged. And Bond tells the villain Scaramanga that Scaramanga doesn't even need to necessarily sell the stolen Solix agitator solar power device that he's got, because oil sheikhs would pay just to keep solar technology off the market. And we see it again in Goldeneye 1995 with concerns not only about the rise of satellite technology, but also the vulnerabilities inherent in a move towards banking done digitally and how that can be exploited. And then Spectre in 2015 looked at international espionage alliances like the Five Guys group and problems around unwitting surveillance. That's just to give 3 examples in sort of 7 decades of the way that Bond has looked at current modern trends in technology and the potential issues that they could create. Bond frequently comes to represent the Gothic emphasis on the permeability of the human body to the threat of technology, as Dr. Germana puts it in her Skyfall chapter. And these narratives of future change and modernity are then inevitably haunted by elements of the past. And one central feature of the Gothic mode, which frequently comes up in discussions of it, is often described along the lines of being the past's intrusion upon the present. And I'd argue that within modern popular culture, the character of James Bond himself is an excellent excellent example embodying this concept of the past intruding upon the present. In late 1995, in the run up to the release of Goldeneye, which was the first Pierce Brosnan James Bond film, the journalist David Gritton wrote a widely reproduced and circulated article in the Daily Telegraph of forms of which were later syndicated in the LA Times and the Irish Independent and a variety of other international publications, questioning, is James Bond still relevant in a world with no Cold War? And this is a screenshot of the version of the article that appeared in the LA Times, and it was headlined, as you can see, Brosnan's license to save. Does anyone care about James Bond anymore? Pierce Brosnan and his backers are betting that he'll be able to revive the aging Bond franchise. Gritton in the article describes GoldenEye's plot as the villains aim to bring down money markets in key financial centers. It's a decent story, but surely Bond needs bad guys to justify its existence. If his enemies are now so subtle and cultivated, it needs a computer hacker to outwit them, not some midlife bedhopper with a Walther PPK, a weakness for martinis, and a corny line in puns. And that line about computer hacking feels particularly telling in the context of those anxieties around changes in technology that I mentioned just before. And interestingly, the series itself would make a similar commentary in the 2012 film Skyfall, with Ben Whishaw's new youthful version of Q insisting that he can do more damage with his laptop sitting in his pajamas before his first cup of Earl Grey in the morning than Bond could do in the field. And Gritton's article in 1995 came at a time of deep uncertainty for the series, with a then unprecedented 6-year gap between GoldenEye and the prior film, License to Kill, in 1989. And the world in that time had changed and was continuing to change greatly. And for example, the Cold War was considered over. Bond's old enemies of the USSR and KGB, who had been utilized as recently as the 1987 film The Living Daylights, had been dissolved. And then similar questions about Bond and relevancy and does he still work in the modern world were then raised during a period of uncertainty between Die Another Day in 2002 and Daniel Craig's appearance in Casino Royale in 2006. And then again around Bond's 50th anniversary and the release of Skyfall in 2012. And indeed, they're showing up again in the wake of No Time to Die, which was a pretty definitive end for the Daniel Craig version of that character. Sorry if you haven't seen the film yet, but the current anxieties over the direction of the franchise following that definitive end for the character and Amazon's high-profile full takeover the last week have again put this question back in the current news cycle. So having this sort of discussion over a 7-year-old media franchise, both ironically and fittingly, seems quite timely. But this all too frequent line of questioning, repeatedly asking whether Bond as a character, as an archetype, is still relevant to the world, is I would argue, to misunderstand one of the key fundamental aspects of what and who James Bond is as a character and what he represents. David Punter, in his 2007 work on modernity rather than his other work looking specifically at the Gothic, noted the Bond series as being, to quote him, a combination of modernity and war, composed of a mixture of weaponry, speed, and sexual allure. And while it is true that the Bond series does feature many trappings of the modern world in its iconography, such as global travel and cars and technology, I'd argue that the character of Bond himself is in many ways not one of them, despite the series' liberal attitudes around sex and violence, and that his timelessness by way of sort of untimeliness is central to the character's longevity, that's the series' long-standing appeal, and also its ability to repeatedly reinvent itself over several decades. And while at first it may seem logical to ascribe this timelessness to the fact the films themselves are initially a product of the 1960s, and for example, the costume designer Lindy Hemming commented around the release of Skyfall that she had intentionally styled Daniel Craig's look in that film after that of Sean Connery in the 1960s Bond films to demonstrate a clear lineage and heritage between the two. And then the Fleming books themselves are a decade older even than that. And then we combine that with the Bond character's own stereotype around formal and conservative manner of dressing and drinking, eating, driving, etc. I would suggest that actually this timelessness, rather than necessarily being metatextual on the part of audiences like that, is instead inherent to the Bond character's own out of time sensibilities. Bond was described by Vesper Lynd in the first Fleming Bond novel, Casino Royale, as looking like Hoagie Carmichael. Vesper says he's very good looking. He reminds me rather of Hoagie Carmichael. And on the left, he has an image of Hoagie Carmichael to go alongside Fleming's own sketch of Bond he created in 1957 as a reference for the then upcoming Daily Express comic adaptation of the novels. And Hoagie Carmichael is a name that almost inevitably probably means nothing to a lot of modern readers who tackle Casino Royale for the first time in 2025, unless you have a specific knowledge or interest in Tin Pan Alley songwriters of the early 20th century. And yet, even when the novel was first published in 1953, Hoagie Carmichael was a man whose career heights had been in the decades prior, in the 1930s and 1940s. And for example, his most well-known song, Stardust, was written in 1927. And while he was then and still is a songwriting legend among people who appreciate that sort of music and have an interest in it, he was perhaps not be the first name you might think of if you were looking to create a dashing, modern, young super spy for a booming post-war, early 1950s world. Bond wasn't described as looking like Cary Grant or Richard Burton. He was Hoagie Carmichael. And even though Bond himself in Casino Royale, when he looks in the mirror, disagrees with Vesper's assessment that he looks like Hoagie Carmichael, the character of Gala Brand in the later novel Moonraker reasserts that actually, yes, he does look like Hoagie Carmichael. And I think you can see the resemblance between Fleming's sketch and that picture, which suggests to me that Fleming clearly intended to be actually some sort of resemblance between the two. And Bond's wider accoutrements in Casino Royale, David Punter's weaponry and speed and sexual allure, are again perhaps not exactly reflective of what a typical modern audience member may think of Bond, having grown used to the formula of the slightly more lavish and indeed the more technological cinematic on-screen Bond. For example, the literary Bond of Casino Royale drives a 4.5-liter Bentley, which is described by Bond as being almost new. That was being bought by Bond almost new in 1933. And so that's some 20 years already before Casino Royale's 1953 publication day. And you can see it here in an illustration from the 2015 folio edition of the novel by Faye Dalton. And Bond's gadgets in that book amount essentially to a long-barreled Colt Army Special 45, which again was an early 20th century pre-First World War gun, which would soon be discontinued in production not long after Casino Royale was published. And these sort of items and trappings in that book have always struck me as having quite a sort of pulpy adventure boy's own story vibe with them, a little removed from what, again, a modern interpretation of what James Bond would wield or drive would probably be. And indeed, Ian Fleming himself actually owned a 1918 Boy's Own annual given to him when he was a 10-year-old child, which remained in his personal library throughout his life, which suggests that he certainly treasured those stories and may have used some aspects of them in creating the Bond character. And furthermore, Bond nowadays is frequently depicted as something of a fashion symbol, albeit of a more formal style, but it's due in no small part to the cinematic marketing and branding partnerships with high-end companies such as Brioni in the Brosnan era and Tom Ford with Daniel Craig. But the Bond of Fleming's work, while certainly relatively well-dressed and certainly fussy and discerning about the materials and brands and types of clothes he wears, and often that amounts to wearing the same outfit all the time. He's frequently described as wearing Sea Island cotton shirts, for example, and moccasins. Already by the standards of the 1950s, the early 1960s, when the books were published, he's depicted as something of a throwback, eschewing a true modern style. For example, when Bond goes undercover in the United States in the second novel, Live and Let Die, he, to quote Bond, had to accept wearing patent ties and socks and what Fleming describes as nylon vests brackets called T-shirts. And Bond firmly refuses anything more dashing than plain blue suits. Bond is also shown packing a black and white check houndstooth suit in Diamonds Are Forever, which then reappears 3 books later for Bond's golf game against Aura Goldfinger and Goldfinger, where it's then described as being battered and yellowing. And my point with this is that Bond, to me at least, in my reading of the literary character, has always felt as something of a remove from true modernity from his literary inception. And he, in many ways, has always represented and embodied this aspect of the Gothic past intruding upon the present. Bond being a throwback did not merely originate in anxieties in 1995 and concerns over a film franchise that had by that point been running for more than 3 decades. And now, when similar articles come about, more than six, but was an inbuilt aspect of the literary character from his very first appearance. Um, so, with this Gothic framework of past and present around the character of Bond himself, it then is perhaps natural that this lends itself to incorporation of further elements related to the Gothic mode within Fleming's literary works. Umberto Eco, for example, in his chapter Narrative Structures in Fleming from his 1979 collection, The Role of the Reader, Explorations in the Semiotics of Text, describes the death of the villain Mr. Big in Fleming's Live and Let Die as, to quote him, pure Gothic. And I'll read an extract from it now, which I've cut down for time and for just how graphic it really is, but hopefully you'll get an idea of what Eco is talking about here. It was a large head, and a veil of blood streamed down over the face from a wound in the great bald skull. Bond could see the teeth showing in a rictus of agony and frenzied endeavor. Blood half veiled the eyes that Bond knew would be bulging in their sockets. A splash of water cleared some blood away from the eyes. They were wide open, staring madly towards Bond. They held no appeal for help, only a fixed glare of physical exertion. Even as Bond looked into them, now only 10 yards away, they suddenly shut, and the great face contorted in a grimace of pain. Both arms stopped flailing in the water, and the head went under and came up again. A cloud of blood welled up and darkened the sea. 2 6-foot thin brown shadows backed out of the cloud, then dashed back into it. The body in the water jerked sideways. Half of the big man's left arm came out of the water. It had no hand, no wrist, no wristwatch, but the great head, the drawn-back mouth full of white teeth almost splitting it in half, was still alive. The head floated back to the surface. Then the shark's snout came right out of the water, and it drove in towards the head. The lower curved jaw opened so that the light glinted on the teeth. There was a horrible grunting scrunch and a great swirl of water. Then silence. And as I mentioned, this is a shorter version than what appears in the book. It goes on even longer than this. And Eco compares this horrific, drawn-out death to Matthew Gregory Lewis's Monk in his Gothic novel, The Monk, a Romance, in which it takes that character several days to die. And this similar physical precision of painful imagery, as Eco puts it, then recurs throughout Fleming's Bond, particularly in the frequent scenes of torture, such as Fleming's description in Diamonds Are Forever of Bond being stomped and kicked by Winton Kid while they're wearing football boots, or the torturous gauntlet with trials of burning heat and electricity and venomous spiders he's forced to undertake in Dr. No. And so Fleming's Bond novels, with all of their pulpy escapism, at least on the surface, are replete with a number of other examples of Eco's pure Gothic. And indeed, the title of this presentation itself, Something Evil Comes This Way, is taken from the title of the 17th chapter of Fleming's novel You Only Live Twice, which itself presents a Japanese Gothic take on a Bond mission, with Bond's nemesis Blofeld having sequestered himself in a Japanese castle on the coast, described by Bond's ally Kissy Suzuki with the flavor of a 19th century horror. We do not usually talk about that place. It is almost a forbidden subject on Kuro. It is as if hell had suddenly opened its mouth half a mile away across the sea from our home. She didn't look at the fortress, but gestured with her head. And so Blofeld's fortress, this sort of place of dread to people living around it, where he's luring people from across Japan to his garden of death to commit suicide. Bond describes Blofeld's plan as a monstrous, calculating madness and a demonic concept. It's given this atmosphere of pure evil, this place, with almost unworldly, with references to hell itself having opened through the ground. And this is, of course, quite a notable contrast to Blofeld's lair in the cinematic Roald Dahl written, Lewis Gilbert directed screen adaptation of You Only Live Twice, with Blofeld's Spectre volcano based on all of its gleaming Ken Adam designed mid-century modern appearance. And these two images show on the left the beautiful illustration of the destruction of Blofeld's fortress from the 2021 folio edition of You Only Live Twice, again illustrated by Faye Dalton. And the right shows the wonderful, expansive set designed by Ken Adam from the 1967 film adaptation. And naturally, this film was produced at a time where Bond films were feeling the need to always push themselves bigger and better and be bolder than the previous film. And in this way, it illustrated a very different inverse tension between the past and the present, with this incredibly ancient extinct volcano hollowed out to create Spectre's base to disrupt the then ultra-modern Cold War space race between Russia and the United States. And of course, the very term of Spectre itself conjures up these ready images of hauntology and ghosts. And Spectre was seemingly one of Fleming's favorite words, and it recurs several times within his Bond literary canon. We see Bond in pursuit of the Spectre decoding machine in From Russia with Love, and with his later change to the Lecter in the film adaptation to avoid confusion with the organization Spectre, who served as the villains in that film rather than the KGB in the original novel. The Spang brothers' Las Vegas ghost town hideout of Spectreville in Diamonds Are Forever, which is the scene of Bond's torture at the hands of Winton Kidd, which I mentioned before. Again, this was unfortunately cut from the film adaptation. And then we have the villainous organization of Spectre itself. Yet it is Fleming's Bond, who himself is a character who I feel has the most tendency to haunt his own narratives, both figuratively and in the case of the novel The Spy Who Loved Me, more literally, with Bond only appearing 2/3 of the way through the book. By this point, of course, this was quite a relatively late novel in the Bond literary cycle, and readers had this sense of always following Bond through his mission. Bond was essentially the point of view character, and with the exception of a very few instances, such as the opening chapters of From Russia with Love, which follow the villains, the reader has always been with Bond. So there's this sense when you read The Spy Who Loved Me, you're wondering where Bond is. He eventually does turn up, arriving at an old motel in a forest in the middle of a thunderstorm, where a young woman named Vivian Michelle is being menaced by two gangsters called Slugsy and Horror. And Viv is haunted throughout by her own dramatic past, with much of the book's opening third being a recounting by Viv of the horrific things that she's already endured in her life and what led her to take this job at this old remote Dreamy Pines motel. And as I say, this is a radical departure from Fleming's long-established style for writing a James Bond story. You were with Viv Michelle for most of the novel, thinking, when is James Bond going to turn up? Because surely he will. The Daily Express comic adaptation and their depiction of the arrival of these two gangsters is I think, a very fittingly depicted with the aesthetics of pure Gothic horror. We see them as sort of half-glimpsed terrors enveloped in these sheets of rain, attempting to be invited inside by Viv Michelle, like some sort of classic folklore vampire. And I don't think it's any coincidence that Fleming chose to set the story of The Spy Who Loved Me on Friday, October the 13th, which is, of course, a cursed day in a haunted month. Though, of course, if you've seen the cinematic version of The Spy Who Loved Me, this all seems very different. You may think that this isn't in there at all, and this is because The Spy Who Loved Me was a novel that Fleming himself was apparently always unhappy with, and insisted that when it was to be adapted for the screen, it would utilize only the title and no plot or character elements. Yet it remains one of, if not my personal favorite of his works, perhaps in no small part because of this brilliant evocation of this aspect of Bond's character honing over the narrative and being an almost sort of unseen, unfelt presence. Unfortunately, because of time, this isn't something I'd like to expand on as much as I'd like, but a really interesting point was raised in a discussion after the talk earlier, about this idea of the doppelganger, and indeed whether Bond himself, through these various iterations and incarnations through various media, can be said to have some connection to this idea. And I'd argue that the most notable manifestation of this concept within the cinematic version of Bond is from its recurring villain archetype of the dark reflection of Bond. Now, Bond films tend to have a number of these villain archetypes. Some of the most common ones are sort of the megalomaniacal billionaire, which you get in Goldfinger and Tomorrow Never Dies, for example, or a foreign power like the USSR and the KGB in a film like Octopussy or The Living Daylights. But there's also this idea of the dark reflection of the character of Bond himself. And now this stretches back as a concept all the way to the second film, From Russia with Love, where we see on the left here, the Spectre assassin Red Grant, played by Robert Shaw, who was clearly modeled on Sean Connery's interpretation of Bond in his look and his dress with the grey flannel suits and white pocket square. And albeit he's one shown to have less class and understanding of matters of refinement than Bond. For example, Bond susses that he should have realized Grant was a villain because Grant orders red wine with fish. Now, this more suave version of Grant was actually an innovation for the screen, with the literary Grant of Fleming's original From Russia with Love novel being much more rough and psychotic. And indeed, the literary Grant is even implied to be some sort of werewolf with this past history of unstoppable bloodlust and urge to kill people whenever there's a full moon. And this has been a recurring staple of the series from then on. And we see it with, for example, former MI6 operatives like Alec Trevelyan, 006 in Goldeneye, and Raul Silva in Skyfall. But one of the most fascinating examples, I think, comes in Dine of the Day with Toby Stevens, um, portraying the villain Gustav Graves, who's on the right here, who is secretly a North Korean colonel called Moon, who undergoes DNA therapy. Now, stick with me here, to disguise himself as a billionaire Westerner. And when Bond deduces Graves' identity later in the film, the two having met in North Korea at the start, Graves claims that he formed the basis of the character of Graves as a mirror image of Bond, just in the details, he says. I chose to model the disgusting Gustav Graves on you, just in the details, that unjustifiable swagger, the crass quips, the self-defense mechanism concealing such inadequacy. And now that I've looked at sort of the character of the literary Bond through this sort of Gothic lens, it's perhaps unsurprising that the cinematic counterpart of Bond would also repeatedly draw upon imagery and ideas of the Gothic in itself. And cinematic Bond moves into full horror territory, perhaps surprisingly rarely. Although when it does, it frequently looks in the direction of the Gothic mode in order to do so. And one interesting aspect of this that I'd like to draw attention to is like it's not exclusive, as I will get to later, but a large proportion of these more horrific and Gothic moments come in films and indeed whole eras of Bond actors that are more commonly thought of as the series at its most camp or comical or light. And indeed, I think this juxtaposition of horror imagery in a lighter tone of a surrounding text can feel incredibly jarring, which as I was mentioning earlier, I think only elevates the shocking nature of some of these moments. Now, the Roger Moore era between the early 70s and the mid 80s is often regarded by critics and general audiences as the series is its most overtly light and comedic in general. Yet Moore's first film, Live and Let Die, is also the series' most overt engagement and intersection with horror and the occult. And as mentioned, Umberto Eco noted the Gothic tones of Fleming's original novel, yet many of the cinematic Live and Let Die's more Gothic elements are unique to the film itself. Mr. Big's pure Gothic prolonged demise at the hands of the sharks, which was detailed by Eco, was not retained for the film. Instead, here, Mr. Big dies much more comedically, literally blowing up after he swallows a compressed air bullet. And I think this sort of two more diametrically opposed demises in tone you could almost not imagine. But as I say, many of the film's innovations were contiguous with elements of the Gothic and the occult. And for example, we see Jane Seymour's character of Solitaire, the film's climax, being given as some sort of virginal sacrifice with a white dress and tied up to be bitten by a snake. And also unique to the film is Geoffrey Holder's portrayal of Baron Samedi, who Fleming's Mr. Big in the novel claimed to be a physical incarnation of in order to control his cult. But in the film, the two are decoupled, with Samedi being a separate character from Mr. Big. And despite Samedi being killed twice by Bond, Samedi still reappears in the film's coda, sitting on the front of a train, laughing directly at the audience and breaking the fourth wall, and directly implied in some way to be the genuine Haitian spirit of the dead rather than a ruse, as in Fleming's work. Live and Let Die then takes these sort of elements of the Gothic and the occult and surrounds and places them in locations that recall classic Gothic motifs, as well as offering a more modern reinterpretation and reimagining of them. A number of the film scenes on the island of San Monique, where Mr. Big, aka Dr. Kananga, has his base, and this includes that climatic confrontation with Baron Samedi I mentioned before, feature cemeteries and tombstones. And Mr. Big memorably retorts to Bond, saying, "I'm Bond, James Bond," to names are for tombstones. And other San Monique locations include this sort of haunted feeling forest full of creepy scarecrows with guns in their mouths, and this classic Gothic motif on the bottom left of the secret underground passageway which leads into the villain's lair. And to these more traditional locations, the film adds its own more contemporary twists in the scenes set in New York, where the place Bond is taken by Mr. Big's henchman to be executed is depicted as this sort of hellish, decaying wasteland of a place. This was, of course, at the time when New York City had a great amount of infrastructure problems and decaying buildings and architecture. And this is, I feel like, a a literal evocation of the past, evoking past intruding again upon the present. And albeit this is much more recent past befitting of a New York location, there's no sort of Gothic castles. Instead, we have this American Gothic location continuing to haunt the surrounding landscape. Um, the aforementioned and aptly named steel-toothed character Horror in the literary Spy Who Loved Me was then transformed into the filmic steel-toothed Jaws in the Spy Who Loved Me adaptation, one of the very few cinematic holdovers from Fleming's work, which they managed to, I think, get around this moratorium by Fleming, who by that point died, of not using any elements from the novel by changing the character's name and making them essentially quite different. And again, here they give Jaws a Gothic twist. In the film, he's presented as a vampiric character, unkillable, and somehow silently gliding through the film despite his immense size. And there's several occasions in the film where he somehow goes unnoticed by the protagonists until he strikes at them quite stealthily and then dispatches his victims with a bite to their neck. And this vampiric nature was very much communicated in the film through the cinematography. Now, this sort of comparison clip here shows Jaws' first on-screen kill of Fekish inside an Egyptian tomb, which clearly pays homage to the 1958 Hammer horror adaptation of Dracula featuring future Bond star Christopher Lee, particularly drawing direct references to the scene of Dracula attacking Mina. You can see Jaws and Dracula slowly menacing towards their victims before they incapacitate them with a swift grab, followed by then a very drawn out, tension filled move towards going in for the inevitable bite. And this Dracula imagery is emulated further in Jaws's next kill, that of the character of Max Kelber at his club, where again we get these sort of opposing shots of the victim looking up in horror, with then the corresponding response shot of the villain then looking down on them, baring their teeth, before the victim is discovered by the hero lying prostrate, bleeding from their neck. Now, of course, unlike Dracula, Jaws is not particularly romantic antagonist, yet there is something disturbing long in its disturbing long drawn out nature with which he bites his victims, both male and female, which I think is again reminiscent of the vampire, and it feels almost sensual despite the victim's evident terror at the situation. These two still show Jaws attacking Anya Masva in The Spy Who Loved Me, and Manuela in Moonraker, showing this sort of, again, this long drawn out motion of the bite rather than like a swift action that you may expect. Now, in this latter scene in Moonraker, Jaws disguised as a carnival clown, which I was talking about before, is I think one of the series' deviations into more pure horror. And Moonraker is said with a great deal of justification, much as I adore that film, to frequently be seen as the series' height of comedy and camp, including things like a double taking pigeon and a gondola that turns into a hovercraft. Yet in that same film, it also has this sequence of pure uncanny terror where Jaws, as I say, disguised as the clown, first silently watches Bond and Manuela in this in the shot at the top, which goes on an uncomfortably long time as the pair walk off screen, and Jaws just watches them from out of the crowd. And then we get these shots at the bottom of Jaws slowly making his way down the alley towards the pair. And for me, it's one of the most unnerving moments in the entire series, particularly because as it does in the midst of Moonraker of all films. And Moonraker's earlier evocation of the Gothic is, in fact, I would say, even more overt. And I'll show you a short part of this clip so you can see what I mean as far as imagery goes. So you can see in that sequence, so the imagery of Bond's ally and lover Corin in a long flowing 19th century looking white dress being pursued to death by these dogs set upon her by the villain Hugo Drax through this haunted feeling forest with light rays cascading down through the trees. I think it's arguably the most overt evocation of Victorian Gothic aesthetics that the series has ever had, and the sort of dappled light coming through the trees gives the scene a hazy, almost dreamlike feel too, added to by the fact the character of Corin is never addressed again by Bond or Drax or anyone else. And of course, this is in actuality an oversight in the script, which writer Christopher Wood did correct in his own lane, a novelization of the film, which has a moment of Bond musing over Corin having been informed that she's been killed by Drax's dogs, where Bond says, "Bond felt like throwing up. Just a few days before he had made love to the girl. Now she was dead, perhaps because of him. So the implication is almost certainly not that it truly was a fantasy, but nevertheless, this framing adds to the bizarre, uncanny nature of the moment. And that's to say nothing of the fact that all this takes place in a film, which then culminates in a science fact laser battle in space, and that makes it all the more surprising and unusual moment. Now, one of the most common recurring elements in the Bond films of recent decades has been that of some sort of element, a threat or an enemy, a piece of someone's past or something long thought to be forgotten. And this ever-present theme in 21st century Bond films was heralded at the end of the 20th by 1999's The World Is Not Enough, with the character of the terrorist Renard, played by Robert Carlyle, resurfacing to seemingly complete his revenge against Sophie Marceau's Electra King, something he'd begun years earlier before a belated intervention from Judi Dench's M rescued Electra from Renard's imprisonment. And the sins of the past, I think, is perhaps the driving thematic force behind The World Is Not Enough, with the film replete with visual indicators of these tensions and anxieties between the past and the present. Now, this is established in that film's very first shot, and we iris out from the famous James Bond gun barrel sequence onto an image of Bond himself. And this is the only time the series actually does this. Skyfall gets close, but director Sam Mendes said at the time he didn't want to open out from a gun barrel on an image of Bond, so it's actually an empty corridor that Bond then walks around. And we've seen this manifestation of as Bond is past intruding upon the present is the opening image of the film, which then we have a rapid whip pan down the street to identify the location of the scene as Bilbao in Spain, with his image of the ultra-modern Guggenheim Gallery, which at the time of the film's 1999 release, it had been open for less than 2 years, having opened in late 1997. And this dichotomy is then reinforced in the last image before the film goes into its opening title sequence, and then the first image coming out from it, which juxtaposes Bond breaking his shoulder after falling upon the roof of the Millennium Dome, which I think is perhaps the defining British symbol of the coming millennium at the time of the film's release in 1999, contrasted coming out of the title sequence with Sir Robert King's funeral cortege at a remote Scottish chapel, which was shot at the fittingly named Gothic Temple at Stowe Gardens in Buckinghamshire. Now, of course, the film's title itself is of course also a reference to Bond's archaic family motto, Orbis non sufficit, the world is not enough, which was first established in Fleming's On Her Majesty's Secret Service novel before also appearing in that book's cinematic adaptation, while also being the motto of the real world Bond family crest. When Bond is confronted by Electra towards the film's climax in the historic surroundings of Maiden's Tower, Electra says she could have given Bond the world, to which Bond replies, the world is not enough. And Electra says that that's a foolish sentiment, while Bond says that's his family motto. I think that shows the clashing ideas of the pair between the past and the present. The film's climax, as I say, is in this sort of crumbling historic surrounding of Istanbul's Maiden Tower, and it moves from there to the ultra-modern claustrophobic interior of a nuclear submarine. And I think this sweeping shot of the submarine surfacing in Maiden's Tower's submarine pen, which apparently it has, really shows this again, past intruding upon the present, perhaps in this case, the present intruding upon the past, intruding upon the present. As I mentioned, the Maiden's Tower sequence has this confrontation between Electra and Bond, in which she tortures him in an elaborate chair, incorporating a device which gradually breaks Bond's neck with every turn of the wheel. And Electra states that the chair was unearthed nearby by archaeologists. She says, they were digging near here and found some very pretty vases. They also found this chair. I think we ignore the old ways at our peril, don't you? And this makes the torture chair a very literal symbol of the past physically trying to break Bond himself. Yet when Bond collides with the present, physically manifested by the Millennium Dome, it very much broke him. It broke his shoulder. The opening of the film here, at the end of the film, he overcomes not only the past, escaping from Electra's chair, but also the present, which he then goes on to destroy both Renard and his submarine. But this direct confrontation with the past in cinematic Bond can be traced back a little further to Brosnan's first film, Goldeneye. And I'd argue that it is in that film that we truly begin to see this idea of Bond confronting the past more directly as a theme. And Goldeneye evokes a number of concepts of both horror and the Gothic throughout, to the extent that I'd argue that digital plot wrapped in many aesthetics and features of the Gothic mode puts it in the realm of a technological Gothic. And the entire film has this quite eerie feeling, due in no small part to Eric Serra's at times bizarre and genuinely unsettling electronic score, which stands as quite a unique entry in the series. And Goldeneye establishes this uncanny atmosphere very early on and sustains it. And one of its more bizarre and unsettling moments in the film is always this mime performance in an amphitheater outside the casino where Bond first meets Xenia. It comes a little out of nowhere, and in combination with the Eric Serra score in the scene, it's genuinely a little uneasy. As I mentioned before, we started the sequence in the St. Petersburg statue graveyard is filled with decaying imagery from the USSR, and it's stylistically shot very much as a horror sequence. Now, I'll play a small part of it now to illustrate the imagery and techniques that I'm talking about here. We see Bond quite uncharacteristically clearly on edge, turning frantically with his gun, with quick cuts to these looming statues of Lenin and Stalin and other USSR iconography. And of course, bearing that 1995 article in mind, was perhaps only due to the success of Goldeneye that Bond himself did not join them as another ghost of the Cold War. And throughout this entire sequence, there's this eerie sense of something uncanny just out of sight imperceptibly, which is signified by the way the camera viewing Bond sort of tracks behind and in and out and weaves between these statues, making it feel like it itself, and then thus the viewer was some sort of unseen observer stalking him. And then the scene's climactic reveal of Bond's old friend 006, Alec Trevelyan, who Bond had thought had been killed during a mission to the USSR 9 years before the events of the film, is fantastically eerie, with Trevelyan appearing backlit, slowly walking from the shadows and swirling mist like an apparition before seeing that he's back from the dead. Now, that scene has echoes in a preceding one in which Bond's ally Natalia also encounters someone she thought was dead, which is her friend and fellow programmer Boris. Yet she discovers that Boris is actually in league with Trevelyan and fellow villain Xenia. And the general feeling of unease in that sequence again has the use of classic ghost story imagery, like a door closing by itself and flickering candles, and this strange hooded woman in the corner who feels like some sort of harbinger of something evil coming. And the parallels between the two sequences are no doubt intentional, with Bond and Natalia respectively captured by their former comrades that they thought were dead, who have now turned on them at the end of the sequence, and then they end up together with Trevelyan attempting to kill them both. Now, the character of Xenia is another vampiric Bondian character, though unlike Jaws, she's a more typically romantic one, killing her victims as she does in the midst of sex, with the film coding her vampirism through her costuming, with the sort of repeated black cloaks with high rounded collars that she wears quite often in the film, which evoke the classic silhouette of a 1930s Bela Lugosi Dracula. Now, if we return to some of the ideas in that article from 1995 and sort of combined with the statue park sequence, we can see this idea of ghosts of the Cold War and ghosts of the past, proclaiming in the film's teaser trailer famously said that it's a new world with new enemies and new threats. And yet we see Trevelyan appearing, as I say, like a ghost from the surroundings of this statue Soviet graveyard. But Bond has not directly tackled manifestations of ghosts yet, but came surprisingly close in the original plans for Daniel Craig's second film, Quantum of Solace. And the 2012 book, The James Bond Archives, the film scriptwriter Robert Wade details that an earlier draft by himself and fellow writer Neil Purvis would have seen Ava Grant's character Vesper, who died at the end of the prior film Casino Royale, reappear in flashbacks and as a spectre haunting Bond. Now, Wade unfortunately provides no specifics of exactly what this Vesper spectre and haunting would have entailed, whether it would be in literal manifestations or whether they would have talked to one another, would it all been in Bond's mind, or some sort of metaphor for his fragile mental state in that film. In the final film, Bond's ally René Mathis talks to Bond about these metaphorical pills that he has to make you forget before telling Bond to forgive Vesper and forgive himself. But as the archives point out, Eva Green was contracted for a second film, so this presumably would have involved new footage being shot rather than just reintegrating existing stuff from Casino Royale. Unfortunately, writer Paul Haggis dropped the reappearance of Vesper in his later rewrite of the film, so while she still holds the film figuratively, this more physical haunting was sadly not to be. And I'm not sure whether it made Quantum of Solace a better film, but I think probably would have made it a more interesting one. Now, I like to conclude by briefly considering the Sam Mendes directed Daniel Craig film Skyfall, released in 2012. Now, considering the gothic sensibilities of Bond as a character that I've been talking about throughout, and the numerous invocations of the gothic mode through literary, cinematic, and other incarnations of Bond, particularly common in video games, which I just didn't have time to talk about. It's perhaps unsurprising that the makers of Skyfall again look to the gothic when creating this very personal, introspective film about the character of James Bond for the film's 50th anniversary. Now, director Sam Mendes would state that Skyfall was about, quote, reconciling the old and the new, with Bond losing himself, looking into the abyss and staying somehow reborn. And Skyfall in its third act becomes in many ways like a gothic horror take on a James Bond film. And it's an aspect of the film that, outside of Dr. Monica Germano's excellent recent chapter that I mentioned earlier, is something you don't see particularly mentioned often, but when you sort of piece these things together, it starts to make perfect sense. Now, as I mentioned earlier, anxieties over technology have long dominated the field of the cinematic Bond, and essentially Bond throughout his cinematic lifetime has been very frequently depicted as this throwback blunt instrument battling against the dangers and excesses of modern technology, at times with modern technology of his own. And Dr. Germano argues that Skyfall's focus on cyber terrorism points to the natural, artificial, human monster dichotomies that have been at the heart of Gothic science fiction since the publication of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein 1818, a novel with which arguably Skyfall establishes significant parallels. Now, I would agree with this, and I think you can see in Skyfall's antagonist Silva a representation of the creature to Judi Dench's M's Dr. Frankenstein, with Silva exhorting M to look upon your work, mother, as he removes this metal plate from his face to reveal a scarred and broken body, which he believes M had been responsible for creating, with him being a former MI6 agent who she was forced to give up in the field. And he tried to commit suicide with a cyanide pill, which didn't work, and burned a lot of the inside of his face away. And Silva's revenge plot against M is one of the key driving themes throughout the film. Further, I think there's some interesting visual parallels, which I've shown here, between the burning of Skyfall House at the end of that film's conclusion and the burning of the windmill at the conclusion of the classic 1931 Hollywood Frankenstein adaptation. Yeah, Skyfall doesn't limit itself just to being the technologically gothic with cyber terrorism and anxieties around changes in technology in the future. The third act also features a more classically Victorian Gothic style, and the film chooses to situate the entirety of it of Bond's return of the repressed, his return to and subsequent destruction of his childhood home of Skyfall, which he had long since abandoned, and where the film establishes he has had traumatic and unpleasant memories and a series of self-consciously Gothic surroundings. This include the manor house itself, which is old and decaying and dusty, and what little furniture remains is covered in white sheets, conjuring physical representations of the mental ghosts which remain in Bond's head there. And the film's climax moves to Skyfall's own crumbling chapel, which is another physical Gothic manifestation of Bond's past trauma, with the graves of Bond's parents being in the churchyard there. Again, the Gothic secret underground passage in the form of the house's priest hole and adjoining tunnel recur, and it's here that the house's caretaker Kincaid tells M of one of these traumatic memories of Bond's childhood, saying that the night Kincaid told Bond his parents had died, Bond hid in this tunnel for 2 days, and when he did come out, he wasn't a boy anymore. And so Skyfall is shown in many ways to be a haunted house, but one haunted by memories rather than literal apparitions. And the film's shooting script makes this distinction clear, drawing attention to the very undead nature of the house itself, describing this old hunting lodge at the head of a long valley that stretches away for miles. The lodge looks lonely and deserted. Everything has fallen into disrepair, more dead than alive. And the script then later describes Bond's initial arrival at the house as, for Bond, it's like entering a haunted place. And of course, these traumas of Bond's dead parents and an adopted brother, which he thought long dead, evoking another classic Gothic image, and even the return of Judi Dench's deceased M, are utilized in Sam Mendes' follow-up film Spectre. And as the film's opening title tells us, the dead are alive, recalling that description in the Skyfall shooting script of the Skyfall house being more dead than alive. And I'd like to suggest that bring things back to that David Gritton article from 1995 that I mentioned at the start. The dead are still alive. James Bond is still alive despite being dead, and the past embodied by Bond will continue to intrude upon the anxieties and fears of the current present. And as every one of the films in the series says at its conclusion, James Bond will return. Now, thanks very much for your kind attention. If anyone's got any questions or comments, I'd be very happy to hear them. Thank you very much.